They were told they would be stripped, punished, paraded. Instead, they were told to line up and handed dresses. The boots of the guards thudded softly against dry Texas soil as the sun climbed higher. A line of exhausted Japanese women stood barefoot in the dust, their eyes hollow, their uniforms torn. They had once been part of Japan's brutal military infrastructure, forced into roles as so-called comfort girls, now prisoners, discarded by an empire that had lost its war. A cowboy with a sunburned neck and a clipboard walked past them slowly. Then, without a word, he gestured. Bales of folded cloth appeared, dresses, light cotton, clean, colorful. One girl flinched as he held one out. Another, trembling, reached for hers. In silence, the cowboys handed out combs, soaps, even slippers, not to humiliate, but to let them feel like women again. Not prisoners, not tools of war. Just girls, standing barefoot in the sun, staring at dresses they never thought they'd wear again. This was not what they were told to expect, and it was only the beginning. The sun hung low but heavy, burning against the backs of their necks as the order came in clipped English. Line up. The words didn't need translating. The tone alone told them what to do. Slowly, the women obeyed, stepping forward on sore feet, some barefoot, some in torn sandals, eyes fixed on the ground as they moved into position. The dirt beneath them was cracked and pale. Dust rose with every step. Their uniforms, if they could still be called that, clung to bony shoulders like worn-out paper. Some had been stitched and restitched, others barely held together with string. No one spoke. They didn't have to. The silence between them buzzed like a wire, stretched tight with fear. This was the moment they had braced for. Back in Japan, they had been warned of this exact scene. Line up, they'd been told, and prepare for degradation. The Americans would strip them, humiliate them, parade them for their own amusement. Others clenched fists behind their backs, prepared to fight even now, even here. A few swayed on their feet from exhaustion, hoping only that it would be over quickly. They were comfort girls, not soldiers, but the shame that name carried had followed them like smoke. If capture was dishonor, then this must be the final punishment. The cowboy with the clipboard didn't raise his voice. He walked the line slowly, eyes scanning each woman's face with something that looked almost like uncertainty. Behind him, another man, older, with dust on his boots and a sweat-stained hat, carried a box. The women stiffened. This was it, they thought. This was where the breaking began. But then something strange happened. The man with the box stepped forward and held something out. A folded piece of fabric, pale blue, with small white flowers, a dress. The woman he offered it to didn't move. She stared at it like it might bite. The man didn't insist. He simply waited, quiet, holding the dress in both hands. Another cowboy moved down the line, offering a similar bundle to the next girl. A cotton shift, folded neatly, with a bar of soap tucked inside. Then another, then another. No one moved at first. It was as if their limbs had forgotten how. One girl reached out slowly, hand trembling, then snatched the bundle back like a thief. She clutched it to her chest, staring at the soap as if it were a lie. Another woman, older, fell to her knees and began to cry, not loudly, not dramatically. Just soft tears that streaked through the dust on her cheeks. The cowboys said nothing. They didn't gawk or mock. One crouched down and gently placed a comb on the ground beside her. Somewhere behind the barn, a horse stamped its hoof. The sky stretched open and cloudless, and still, no one shouted, no one barked orders. The line remained wobbly, uneven, but intact. In place of cruelty, there was only quiet routine. A hand extended, an offering made. Each woman was given the same: a dress, a comb, a bar of soap, a rag for washing. One girl received a toothbrush and stared at it like a puzzle. Another whispered something in Japanese, too soft to hear, and clutched her cotton bundle like it was her child. The shame they had prepared for didn't arrive. Instead came a discomfort far more disorienting: dignity. Not all accepted it easily. Some still stood rigid, refusing to take the bundles, unsure whether it was a trick. A few turned their heads, defiant even in captivity. But even they felt it that something was off. This wasn't how enemies behaved. The rules, the warnings, the fears, they didn't fit this moment. When the line finally dispersed, the women carried their new belongings to the barn in silence. No guards forced them, no guns pushed them forward. Some walked slowly, glancing down at the fabric in their hands as if it might disappear. Others clutched theirs tightly, unwilling to let go of the first softness they'd held in years. One woman, perhaps 20, paused at the door of the barn and looked back at the cowboys, still standing where they had handed out dresses. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away. Something was beginning to crack, not loudly, not all at once, but like hairline fractures running across the foundation of everything they thought they knew. The Americans hadn't shouted. They hadn't humiliated them. They had made them line up, and then treated them like people. But before they ever stood on American soil, before cotton dresses and combs, before the silence of cowboys and the scent of bacon drifting through barns, they were property, labeled, numbered, silenced. In the final days of the war, the girls were not yet prisoners. They were instruments. The phrase used by their commanders was comfort, unit, support, but everyone knew what it meant. The uniforms were starched, but thin, designed more for presentation than protection. Their duties ranged from scrubbing floors to tending wounds, from serving rice to men they didn't know, to surrendering their own bodies without question. Officially, they were volunteers. Unofficially, there was no door to walk out of. The days bled together: nurses without training, assistants without sleep, girls without voices. They were told it was for the glory of the empire. They were told it was better than starving. They were told not to ask questions. The word comfort hung like poison in the air, a euphemism that buried its own violence. One girl remembered how the nurse would whisper the phrase, "for the emperor," each time she passed another blood-soaked sheet down the line. Another remembered how they were taught to smile through everything, because if they smiled, it couldn't be abuse. That's what they were told. That's what they told themselves, too. Propaganda seeped into every crack of their lives. Radio speeches about American barbarism, posters showing enemy soldiers as beasts, knives dripping, faces twisted in sadistic glee. The instructors warned them that capture would be worse than death, that Americans would do things no language could translate, that honor could only be preserved through death, preferably by their own hands. They believed it, because belief was all they had left. Then, one morning, the bombing began. Not just sirens, but fire, real fire, from the sky. Entire city blocks vanished. Hospitals collapsed in on themselves. The air turned to ash. Those still working at the field stations wrapped the injured in bloodied linen and carried them through clouds of black smoke. There was no more smiling. There was no more "for the emperor." Only silence. Only disbelief. The officers stopped shouting. Orders became whispers. Then the whispers became nothing. One morning, a convoy truck pulled into the remains of a barracks, and the women were loaded in without explanation. Someone muttered, "We're being moved to the front." Another said, "They'll kill us before they let us fall into enemy hands." No one knew where they were going. They passed through towns that no longer looked like towns, just rubble and skeletal homes. Men walked like ghosts. Children stared through broken fences. No one saluted anymore. One of the women, a 19-year-old from Yokohama, looked at the road and whispered, "Even the war looks tired." When they arrived at the port, there were ships, American ones, massive, metal beasts, strangely clean. The guards didn't bark. The American Marines looked at them the way one looks at a storm on the horizon, not with cruelty, but with caution. It confused everyone. The girls waited for the punishment, the stripping, the shame. Instead, they were counted, given blankets, given food. They ate in silence, because their mouths didn't know what else to do. The ship left at dusk. The water was too still. The girls huddled below deck, unsure what awaited them across the ocean. Someone said, "America feeds their prisoners before killing them." Another replied, "They're just fattening us up." That made sense to most of them. But even then, amid steel walls and rusted bolts, one girl found herself staring at the blanket folded on her bunk. She touched it, just once. It was soft. She told herself not to trust it. That softness meant nothing, that the real horror hadn't begun yet. But still, she kept the blanket. She didn't know why. The sea was wide and sickly gray, stretching out in all directions like a sky that had lost its color. The ship groaned beneath them, metal ribs shifting with each wave. Below deck, the air was thick with salt, diesel, and fear that had settled in like mold. The women didn't speak much. When they did, it was in whispers. Their breaths came shallow. Some held hands while they slept. Others curled into corners, trying to make themselves smaller. The bunks were metal and narrow, lined with thin mattresses and wool blankets that still smelled faintly of laundry soap. It felt too clean, too strange. Each morning began with the clang of boots above their heads. A routine, but not a cruel one. Meals arrived on trays, rice, meat, something that tasted like cabbage. The girls stared at it suspiciously before eating, chewing as if each bite might explode. One girl, no older than 16, vomited after every meal, her stomach unable to understand the concept of fullness. No one comforted her. Not because they didn't care, but because no one knew how. There was one girl, her name was Ayaka, who kept a notebook tucked into the waistband of her skirt. Its pages were crumpled and sweat-stained. She wrote only at night, by the dim light of the hallway bulb, scrawling lines in tiny kanji as though the words might crawl off the page if she let them sit too long. She never shared what she wrote, but others watched her and began to wonder if maybe there was a way to remember all of this, some way to make it real. The Marines who guarded them were young, American boys, barely older than the prisoners themselves. Their uniforms were clean, their faces sunburned, their hands rough, and yet they didn't leer, they didn't laugh. They spoke little, and when they did, it was mostly to one another. A few tried broken Japanese. Eat, sit, okay. But mostly they stood at a distance, rifles slung across their backs, watching with a kind of polite discomfort. One handed out cups of water and said "please" each time. That single word rang louder than a gunshot. None of it made sense. The girls had been prepared for cages, for beatings, for things worse than death. They'd been told that the Americans would parade them naked, drag them through cities, force them into some new foreign kind of servitude. Instead, they were given privacy, food, time. Nothing felt safe, but nothing felt savage either. And that, somehow, was more unsettling than the worst they had imagined. When land finally appeared on the horizon, no one cheered. No one even moved. The coast looked unreal, like something pulled from a foreign movie reel, docks, trucks, cranes rising like skeletons into a blue sky. The air shifted. It smelled like oil and grass and something else. Something alive. They were herded onto buses, quietly, efficiently, and driven for what felt like hours. The roads stretched long and straight, lined with fields that swayed in the wind. Cotton, maybe, or wheat. At one point, they passed a group of children riding bicycles near a white fence. One of the girls pressed her hand to the window, staring, her breath fogging the glass. The children didn't notice the bus. Or if they did, they didn't care. Then came Texas, not in words or signs, but in sensation. The heat hit like a wall, dry, sharp, constant. The dust clung to their skin, to their hair. When they stepped off the bus, they saw cattle in the distance, real cattle, grazing slow under a burning sky. And there, beside a wooden gate, stood the cowboys. They looked nothing like monsters. They wore hats. Their shirts were rolled at the sleeves. One leaned against a fence post, chewing something, eyes shaded. Another stood with a jug of water in his hand. None of them said a word. The girls stood in the silence, the same kind of silence they had lived in for years. But this silence was different. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of not knowing what comes next. And for the first time in a very long time, that terrified them more. The door to the barn creaked open with the sound of old wood and rusted hinges, and the girls stepped inside, one by one, blinking at the dimness. The air was dry, heavy with the scent of hay, leather, and dust. Sunlight streamed through the slats in the walls, drawing golden lines across the floor. A few horses snorted quietly in the stalls beyond, shifting in place. No shouting, no barking orders, no eyes that lingered too long. Just space, just quiet. Against the far wall were rows of cots, real ones, not straw mats or floors or sheets of tin, actual beds with frames and folded blankets. Some had pillows. One girl, barely over 5 feet tall, stood frozen beside hers, staring like it might vanish. Another reached out and touched the corner of her blanket, then quickly pulled her hand back. It was soft. That scared her more than if it had been rough. When the guards left and the door shut behind them, they just stood there for a while. The barn wasn't locked. No chains. No bars on the windows. A few sat down. One laid back slowly, testing the mattress beneath her with careful weight. When it didn't snap or disappear, she let her body sink into it and stared up at the wooden ceiling. Her name was Emiko. She had not been truly horizontal in months. Her bones ached not from pain, but from confusion. Night fell quietly. Outside, the crickets began their chorus. Somewhere in the distance, a harmonica played a slow, aimless tune. Emiko lay awake, listening, not because she was afraid, but because she wasn't. Her eyes followed the beams above her, tracing the dust floating through moonlight. There were no screams, no engines, no commands, only the sound of cows breathing, and the faint clink of metal from the far end of the barn. Then the door opened again. A cowboy stepped in, hat in hand. He didn't come close, just approached the stove near the center of the barn, crouched down, and stirred something in a battered pot. The smell came first onions, beef, something that made the air suddenly feel heavier. Hunger twisted inside every stomach in that room. The man ladled stew into tin cups, placed them gently onto a wooden tray, and left it by the barn door. Emiko didn't move at first. No one did. But then one girl stood. She approached the tray slowly, knelt beside it like it was a shrine, and picked up a cup. She brought it back to her cot. Both hands wrapped around it like it was fire. Others followed. The first sip was almost painful. The salt stung their tongues. The oil clung to their lips. The warmth filled their chests like smoke. Emiko drank and felt tears press behind her eyes, not from the taste, but from the memory. She remembered rice. She remembered miso. She remembered what it felt like to eat without shame. And now, here, fed by the hands of the enemy, she felt shame all over again because this kindness was unbearable. Later, when the cups were empty and the barn had gone still again, a medic entered. He said nothing, just walked down the row of cots with a basket of bandages and a tin box of ointment. He didn't touch them without asking. He motioned, waited, knelt. A few girls flinched when he got too close, but he didn't react. He unwrapped old wounds, applied fresh gauze, checked for fever. When he came to Emiko, he paused. Her ankle was swollen from the march. She nodded, barely. He knelt. His hands were calloused, but gentle. When he finished wrapping it, he stood, nodded once, and walked away. On her pillow was a folded cloth. Inside it, a bar of soap, white, unscented, clean. She held it in her hand long after the lights dimmed, not because she needed to wash, but because it was the first thing she'd been given that didn't come with a demand. No trade, no cost. It was just given. And that, somehow, made it the hardest thing of all. The next morning began with a knock. Not a shout, not a bang, just 3 calm taps against the barn door, followed by a pause. Then the door eased open and a figure stepped through, another cowboy, this one younger, with sunburnt cheeks and a clipboard in his hand. He cleared his throat and said a single word, "Check." The girls stiffened. The word didn't need translation. It meant inspection. It meant exposure. Emiko's stomach turned. She looked at the other women, their faces already pale with dread. They had been waiting for this moment since they stepped off the ship. The kindness couldn't last forever. Sooner or later, the Americans would show what they really were. They were led, group by group, into a smaller building beside the barn. Inside, it smelled like alcohol and gauze. The light was softer, the windows high. A row of cots had been set up, and near them stood 2 medics, one American doctor, clean-shaven, with wire-rimmed glasses, and another older man who seemed more like a farmer than a soldier. They gestured gently, motioning for the women to sit. Emiko's heart pounded as she perched on the edge of a cot. Her eyes darted around, scanning for exits, for weapons, for threats, but none came. The doctor approached, gloves already on, and knelt beside her. He didn't touch her at first, just looked at her ankle, the one that had been wrapped the night before, and made a soft, thoughtful sound. Then he nodded once, unwrapped the bandage, and began to work. His hands were steady, practiced. When he pressed against the swelling, he didn't squeeze. He cradled it, like something delicate. He asked questions, though she didn't understand them. Still, his tone was calm. No mocking, no grabbing, no smirking, just care. Another girl flinched when a medic approached her with a stethoscope. She covered her chest with both arms. Trembling, the medic froze, then slowly knelt down and placed the stethoscope against his own heart, tapping it twice, and smiled. She didn't smile back, but she let him listen. One girl had a bruised wrist deep purple, from months ago, never treated. The doctor examined it silently, then gently wrapped it in fresh gauze like he was handling porcelain. When he finished, he reached into a tin and pulled out a small tin of balm. He held it out. She didn't move. Her hands stayed in her lap, frozen. Another girl had to take it for her. Later, a cowboy passed through the barn, carrying a wooden crate filled with combs, bars of soap, and rolled-up towels. He offered them like offerings at a shrine. One by one, the women accepted them slowly, suspiciously. When he offered one girl a comb, she reached out, but her hand shook too violently to take it. He didn't laugh. He didn't push it into her hand. He simply set it down beside her and walked away. That night, she cried, not from pain, not from shame, but from confusion. The tears came hot and fast and silent, soaking into the cotton of her blanket. She turned her face to the wall, afraid someone might hear, but no one said a word. By the third day, something strange began to happen. The barn was quiet, but inside, something was shifting. Some of the girls began to wash their hair. Not just rinse it, really wash it. Scrub the scalp, untangle the knots, rub soap until it foamed. They sat outside on overturned crates, combing each other's hair in the dry Texas air. One girl found a shard of mirror wedged between two wooden beams. She stared into it like it was a stranger. Her reflection looked older, thinner. Her eyes were tired, but they were hers. Emiko washed her face that night, scrubbed it until her skin tingled. Then she looked down at her hands, clean, raw, trembling, and whispered a name she hadn't said in years. Her own. The word echoed in her mind long after the lights dimmed. Not spoken aloud, not acknowledged by anyone else, but alive in her chest all the same. When morning came, it arrived without orders. No whistles, no shouting. Just the pale wash of sunlight slipping through the slats of the barn and the distant sound of cattle shifting in their pens. For a moment, the women did not move. They lay where they were, unsure if this quiet was allowed. Then someone stood, another followed, and soon, without instruction, they were awake. A man appeared at the door with a clipboard and a hesitant smile. He spoke slowly, choosing his words as if they mattered. Today, you can help. If you want. He gestured toward the yard. No one has to. The phrase landed strangely in the air. If you want. Choice was not a language they understood. Choice had been beaten out of them long before the war ended. Yet here it was, offered so plainly it felt like a trick. Some remained where they were, stiff and unmoving. Others stood uncertainly, glancing around as if waiting for permission to be revoked. Outside, the morning was already warm. Dust curled beneath their feet. A line of wooden tubs had been set out near the wash-house, filled with soapy water. Nearby, baskets of clothing waited to be folded. Beyond that, chickens pecked lazily at the ground, watched by a man leaning against a fence. He raised a hand in greeting, awkward and shy, then went back to his work. One by one, the women drifted toward the tasks. No one barked orders. No one watched closely. They chose tentatively at first, then with growing certainty. One woman knelt beside a wash tub and dipped her hands into the water. Another followed. Soon sleeves were rolled, and fingers moved through fabric in steady rhythm. The work was familiar, almost comforting. Emiko found herself beside a crate of eggs, unsure what to do until a young cowboy crouched nearby and demonstrated how to gather them without breaking the shells. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if afraid of startling her. When she tried, the egg wobbled in her palm and nearly fell. She gasped. He caught it before it hit the dirt and handed it back with a crooked grin. That was when it happened. The sound, a soft laugh. It escaped her before she could stop it. The moment hung in the air, fragile as glass. She covered her mouth, eyes wide, waiting for something terrible to follow. But nothing did. The cowboy only chuckled, tipping his hat before turning back to his work. The laughter spread quietly. One woman snorted when a chicken darted between her legs. Another giggled when a gust of wind lifted her skirt and sent her scrambling. Soon, there were small sounds everywhere, breaths, chuckles, half-formed smiles. No one laughed loudly. It felt forbidden, but it felt good. and that frightened them more than the silence ever had. Later, as the sun dipped lower, a sound drifted across the yard music. A man sat on an upturned crate near the fence, a banjo resting against his knee. His fingers moved lazily over the strings, coaxing out a tune that wandered like a lazy river. It wasn't a marching song. It wasn't triumphant. It was something softer, something meant for evenings. The women paused in their work. Some stood still, rags in their hands. Others sat on overturned buckets, listening. The melody wound through the air and wrapped around them, settling somewhere deep in their chests. One girl closed her eyes. Another swayed slightly, as if her body remembered a rhythm her mind had forgotten. No one spoke. No one dared break the moment. The music carried something dangerous peace. And peace, for women who had lived on fear, felt almost forbidden. As dusk fell, lanterns were lit. The air cooled. The smell of cooked food drifted from the kitchen again. Emiko sat on the steps of the barn, knees pulled to her chest, watching the sky darken. For the first time since she could remember, her thoughts were not of survival, they were of tomorrow. She felt it then, quietly, without warning, not happiness, not relief, something stranger, the sense that maybe, just maybe, she was allowed to exist without being used. The idea terrified her, but it also made her breathe a little easier. Topic 3. American Eyes. What the guards saw in the women. The paper was thin, off-white, and folded crisply in half. A pencil, dulled at the tip, was placed beside it on the cot. The guard who handed it out did not explain much, just said the word letter, followed by a soft home. Then he smiled, a brief, unsure flicker of kindness, and walked on. The barn grew quiet, too quiet. Dozens of women stared at their blank pages, and no one moved. Emiko held the pencil like it might splinter between her fingers. She had not written a letter in over 2 years. Even before her capture, mail had been censored, filtered, reduced to empty platitudes meant to reassure parents while hiding the truth. But now, what could she even say? That she was still breathing? That she had not been beaten in weeks? That the Cowboys said "ma'am" and tipped their hats? That her meals came on plates? Across the barn, one girl wrote slowly, deliberately. Her name was Mika. Emiko had seen her cry silently after washing her hair. Now, she wrote just 4 words and then stopped. When Emiko peeked later, she saw them. I am alive. Somehow. The rest of the page stayed empty. What else could be said? Some wrote longer letters, details about the weather, the food, the ranch. They described the sound of harmonicas at night and how they were allowed to feed chickens. One girl added, "The enemy gave me a comb." That sentence would haunt Emiko for weeks. But there were limits. Invisible fences around every word. How do you write to a family that believes you died honorably? How do you tell them that you lived and that your survival was made possible by the very men they called barbarians? The shame was not simple. It was layered. It wasn't just surviving. It was surviving like this, being shown mercy by those they were taught to despise. The enemy was supposed to burn villages and violate bodies. Instead, they offered stew and bandages. Instead, they asked, "Are you okay?" in broken Japanese. At night, Emiko would lie awake, the letter resting unfinished beneath her pillow. Every time she picked up the pencil, her hand hesitated. If she wrote it all down, it might become real. The quiet, the kindness, the softness of the cot beneath her back. She wasn't ready to believe in it. Not yet. Meanwhile, the Americans watched. not with the leer of soldiers expecting something in return, but with the confused tenderness of men seeing something they didn't expect. They saw women who flinched at laughter, women who wrapped food in cloth napkins to save for later, out of habit, women who wouldn't meet their eyes. The cowboys didn't always understand, but some of them tried. One left small packets of tea near the barn door. Another played soft tunes on his banjo every evening, not for attention, but for atmosphere. A few learned words in Japanese: water, food. Okay. Simple things. Human things. One evening, after chores, Emiko sat near the fence, watching the sun collapse into the dry earth. A young American approached, boots kicking up dust. He offered her a folded envelope. She stared. He nodded and said, "Tokyo." Then he touched his chest and said, "Mother, a beat, letter," and then he walked away. Emiko looked at the envelope in her hands. Her fingers trembled. Maybe her letter wouldn't be read. Maybe it would be intercepted, discarded, ignored. Maybe no one would care. Still, that night, she wrote, "Mother, I am not in a cage. I am not hurt. I do not understand it. But the enemy, he let me write this." She didn't sign it. She just folded the paper, sealed it, and left it with the others in the box by the barn door. It would be sent. Or not. That didn't matter. What mattered was that someone had given her a voice. Even if no one answered, one lazy afternoon, while the sun scorched the dry dirt outside and the barn smelled faintly of cornmeal and hay, a cowboy brought out an old, frayed pack of playing cards. He shuffled them slowly, dramatically. The corners cracked. The red diamonds faded from years of use. The women watched cautiously, sitting on crates and overturned buckets, their chores done for the day. He dealt the cards face down on a wooden table and gestured. At first, no one moved. Then one of the girls, Reiko, the one who had found the mirror shard, stepped forward and picked up the hand. She stared at the shapes: hearts, clubs, spades. The cowboy smiled and tapped the cards, saying softly, "Poker." The next hour was filled with broken language and exaggerated gestures. They learned the rules not by words but by mimicry, watching, pointing, laughing when someone made the wrong move. Another girl, Ayaka, slapped her hand on the table triumphantly and won the round. The cowboy whistled and handed her a harmonica as a prize. She blinked, stunned, then cradled it like something sacred. Later that night, Ayaka sat on the steps of the barn, breathing carefully into the harmonica, fumbling her way into a simple, trembling tune. No one told her to stop. One woman who hadn't spoken in days, Sumiko, began to hum along. The sound rose like a thread of smoke into the dusk, and for a few moments the silence between them all turned into something warm. The next day, someone said, "Thank you," in English. Another replied with, "Good," a word they'd heard the cowboys say often. Then came "okay" and "food," and then the unthinkable, "funny." A cowboy told a joke, something clumsy and sweet about chickens and fences, and Emiko, who had not laughed in months, actually snorted. The sound surprised her so much she covered her mouth with both hands. But the others laughed too, not at the joke, not really, but at the absurdity of it all. The enemy told a joke, and it was stupid, and it made them laugh, and that, somehow, was worse than any insult, because laughter meant something had shifted. That night, a group of women sat around a campfire at the edge of the property, invited by the ranch hands who kept watch. There was stew and cornbread, beans and slices of apple that dripped juice down their wrists. One man played a soft tune on a banjo. Another taught them the word moon. They pointed at the sky, and the girls whispered it back. Moon. They whispered it like a secret. Cultural disarmament came not through orders or treaties, but through these tiny exchanges, passing a spoon, naming a tree, humming along. It wasn't surrender. It wasn't even acceptance. It was something more dangerous. It was familiarity, and with it came joy. Real joy. Fleeting, stolen, guilty. The next afternoon, a woman who had never played cards before bet a ribbon she had hidden in her sleeve and won a game. She grinned, wide and unapologetic, before she realized she was doing it. She froze. The laughter died in her throat. She looked around, ashamed. The other women looked down, because in that moment, joy felt like betrayal. It felt like forgetting, but no one scolded her. And the next day, they played again. Emiko found herself teaching a cowboy how to pronounce her name properly. He tried 5 times. She laughed. This time, she didn't stop herself. Something had begun. Not forgiveness, not trust, but recognition of each other's humanity. And that, more than anything, was the beginning of something irreversible. Are you finding this story as powerful as we do? If so, please like the video and leave a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. It was nailed crookedly to the post just outside the mess hall, its frame chipped, its glass dusty with wind-blown grit. No one knew who hung it. Perhaps one of the cooks, perhaps one of the guards. But there it was. A mirror, full-sized and exposed to the rising sun. The first to see it was Hannah. She wasn't looking for it. She was just returning a tray, head down, shoulders tight, when she caught the shimmer light bending back at her in a way she hadn't seen in years. Her eyes lifted slowly, and there it was. Her reflection. She froze, not out of vanity, not even shock, but because she hadn't truly seen herself since before the war began. The face staring back was thinner than she remembered, pale. There was a small scar above her brow she didn't know she had. But the most jarring thing was this. She looked alive. A quiet gasp behind her. Another girl, Miyuki, had seen it too. She stepped up beside Hana and whispered, "You look clean." It wasn't a compliment. It was a realization, a truth. Within minutes, others joined. A cluster of girls stood silently before the mirror like it was a holy object. Some touched their faces. One brushed at a smudge of dirt on her cheek. Another tucked loose hair behind her ear. No one spoke loudly. There was reverence in the quiet. Then someone returned with a comb. It began as a ripple. They began brushing their hair not out of necessity but intention. Smoothing strands, separating tangles, rediscovering rituals long buried beneath shame and survival. Ribbons appeared, some homemade, some gifted. One girl tied a red piece of cloth around her braid, a gift from the rancher's young daughter who had slipped it into her hand during a chore. Another used twine. Another wore wildflowers. They sat in the sunlight, taking turns. One held the comb while the other sat between her knees. They braided. They giggled softly. They looked at each other not with fear, but with recognition. They were no longer ghosts drifting through a war-torn world. They were girls again, not just alive, but visible. That afternoon, they walked beyond the barn fence, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. They crossed into the pasture where the wind smelled of hay and cowhide and distant rain. Their steps were cautious at first, like deer testing uncertain ground. But they kept walking, together, heads high. The cowboys watched from the porch. One raised a hand, another tilted his hat. The girls nodded back, not in obedience, but in something closer to acknowledgement. They walked in 2s and 3s, skirts brushing against tall grass, arms brushing each other. They pointed out birds. They named clouds in Japanese. They smiled without permission. And perhaps most surprising of all, the guards didn't stop them. They weren't trying to escape. They weren't being monitored. They were simply walking, not as prisoners, not as shameful relics of a lost empire, but as people. When they returned to the barn, the mirror was still there, catching the last light of day. Emiko paused before it. She saw the same face, the same eyes, but she also saw something else, now a flicker of softness at the edges, a quiet strength in her spine. She wasn't healed. She might never be, but she was here. She was whole, and she was no longer invisible. But the sky was just as wide, and the dust just as thick when the call came. "Line up!" It echoed across the yard, but this time it didn't pierce like a whip. There was no bark in the voice, only ritual. The same line, the same boots, digging into the same dirt. But everything else was different. Their shoulders did not slump. Their eyes did not lower. And their dresses, though now worn at the seams and sun-bleached, still belonged to them. That mattered. One by one, they stepped into formation, not as faceless captives, but as women who had lived through something no one outside those barn walls would ever quite understand. Emiko stood near the front. In her hand, she carried a small, leather-bound diary, corners worn, pages filled with fragments in both Japanese and hesitant English. Behind her, Ayaka clutched her harmonica like it was a piece of herself. Reiko had tied the same red ribbon in her hair. A few of them whispered to each other soft, grateful, unfinished words. The trucks arrived just after sunrise. Not military convoys this time, just covered transports meant for relocation. The cowboys stood at the edge of the corral. No one saluted, but they nodded. They tipped their hats. They shuffled their boots awkwardly. A few held out their hands, palms open, hesitant. One of the girls, Sumiko, reached out and took a hand, held it for a moment longer than necessary, and let go without a word. There were no goodbyes, just the kind of silence that spoke volumes. They had been taught that language, how to say everything without needing to say anything. Emiko climbed into the back of the truck, sat against the side, and watched the others follow. No tears. Not now. Not after everything. She had learned how to hold emotion without drowning in it. As the engine rumbled to life, no one waved, but almost all of them looked back. The barn was still there, the mess hall, the crooked mirror, the fence with its wide gates, never truly locked, the field where they had learned to laugh again, the post where someone always left tea, the porch where banjos had played, and the men, the cowboys, the medics, the guards they stood watching, hats in hand, not victors, not jailers, just men, changed, too, because the truth was, the war had ended long ago. But something else had ended here, too, an idea, a belief, a myth about enemies, and what it meant to be saved by someone you were taught to fear. They didn't leave as prisoners. They left as witnesses, and what they carried with them wasn't just a harmonica or a diary. It was a memory that blurred the edges of hatred, that complicated everything they'd once believed, that softened the shape of war. The trucks disappeared down the long road, a trail of dust rising behind them like a whisper, and though they did not cry, their silence held 1,000 unspoken things: grief, gratitude, guilt, and something dangerously close to hope. That hope would follow them, into cities, into courtrooms, into homes where no one asked and few ever dared to understand. But they would know, and they would remember, because once they had been lined up in the heat of a foreign land, certain they would be humiliated, and once they had been lined up again. But that second time, they stood taller. If this story moved you, please like the video and leave a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. And thank you for remembering a piece of history the world nearly forgot.